Hi everyone, welcome back. Today we are looking at the topics of regularization and moving into neural networks. So a quick recap from last time. Here's what we were looking at. So we had introduced our first parametric approach, our first model class, if you will, a linear classifier, which took an input X, converted it into our image, converted it into a long vector of 3072 dimensions. That absolute number is arbitrary, but that's essentially the dimension that we're dealing with. And we did one matrix multiply to give us scores and a bias to ultimately produce the scores for all 10 categories that we were interested in. And this was the visual illustration of these things. If there are 4 pixels and 3 categories, you end up with a 4-dimensional input X. The 3 categories correspond to the rows of this matrix. So this matrix is 3 cross 4. Each of the rows corresponds to one particular category whose classifier you're training. There's a bias that's giving us these scores. We also presented the idea that you can stack in the bias as just an additional column of W. So if you don't see me explicitly write W out, B out, it can be just incorporated within W. So it's still a linear classifier. Let's see. We introduced 3 specific viewpoints. So the algebraic viewpoint, which was just the matrix multiplication viewpoint of these things. The visual viewpoint, which was that we can take each row of W and visualize it as a template. And that gave us intuitions about what our model is picking up from this data set. And of course, the geometric viewpoint, which was about hyperplanes cutting up the space. And so that gave us intuitions about what parts of the space result in high scores for the categories that we're looking at. We had started talking about the notion of defining a loss function and how do we optimize it. Optimization is still coming next time, but the loss function we looked at last time, we introduced 2 different loss functions. One was the softmax cross entropy loss, or the maximum likelihood estimation approach, where you take the negative log of the probability of the correct category yi given xi comma w. So this is for the category annotated in the data set for this image X, what is the probability that your model assigns? And we also introduced the multi-class hinge loss, where you are trying to make sure that the category annotated in the ground truth scores higher than everything else by a margin of 1. And we're summing this up over everything else. We went over a number of intuitions that the margin loss is just trying to get an ordering of scores such that the correct category scores highest. It does not care about relative orderings beyond the first one best. It actually makes no calls about that, but softmax does. And we also talked about softmax being this idea that you can convert scores by exponentiating them and normalizing them to get probabilities, which we can then compare. So this gave us our negative log probability in our example, and we also related this to the maximum likelihood estimation approach. That this is maximizing the likelihood of the observed data. And we said that this maximum likelihood approach is identical to minimizing the KL divergence between the quote-unquote true probability, which really does not actually exist. There's no such thing as a true probability or a correct probability, but an expression of the annotation in our data set as a probability vector, and minimizing the KL divergence, which we were able to show is the same as minimizing cross entropy. There's just a constant factor, which is the entropy of reality, and the true KL divergence is just related to cross entropy by a constant factor. And because that's not a function of our model, minimizing cross entropy is the same as minimizing KL divergence, which also results in being the same as maximizing log likelihood. And I'll skip over this, but that was everything that we covered last time. So I'll pause here, see if any questions come in about the material from last time, and then we can get started on the new material. Okay, then let's get started with the new content. That's where we were last time. So let's get started with the first notion of regularization. So last time we introduced loss functions. We said that they factorized over the data set. We defined L sub I for each example. We said that it somehow tells us how well our model predictions match the training data. Whether it's in terms of the top one score we're assigning and the margin, or whether it's in terms of the entire distribution of those scores with respect to reality, doesn't matter. There's some loss function. It's telling us the fit of our model to data. Typically, that's not the only thing that we optimize. Typically, there is a secondary term in our objective as well. So if L sub W is the objective that we are optimizing, there is a secondary term, which is the regularization term. You may have seen this in your Intro to Machine Learning class. And this is not really a deep learning specific notion. What we will find in deep learning is that regularization intuition is invoked for a lot of even modeling choices, and that's where it gets deep learning specific. But let's first understand what regularization is. Let's just refresh our memories. It is the idea that we want to prevent the model from doing too well on training data. And it's almost like a counterintuitive idea, which is that, it seems like this is all we should care about. We have training data. This is the model fit. And it feels like this is all that we should care about till you realize, of course, that we do not actually care about performance on training data. We care about generalization, so performance on some new data whose loss we obviously cannot compute because we do not have that data yet. And so this second term is usually invoked about that this is encouraging generalization in some way. If you've taken an Intro to Machine Learning class, you know that the Bayesian perspective on these things is that this first term is the negative log probability of the data set given your parameters or models, and we've seen that log likelihood intuition as well. And that's a loss part. And the second term is the negative log probability of just the parameters. What is for different families of regularizers, we will usually be able to form a one-to-one correspondence, though not always. And this is usually expressing an intuition. What do you believe about parameters even before you see any data, even before you go into any data collection mode? What would you like your parameters to look like? This is where domain expertise comes in. This is where you try to express that you want simpler model families, and we'll see that through an example. And this constant is typically a regularization strength or a hyperparameter that you pick on a validation set. Okay, so let's look at this intuition in the case of polynomial regression. So polynomial regression or linear is a generalization of linear regression, and it's one of the simplest sort of problems you can set up to understand things. So let's say we have just one-dimensional, just one dimension, so we don't even need the array, just one-dimensional features, and we're trying to predict a one-dimensional output. Let's say we have a one-dimensional output y, and it could be something like, you measure the square footage of a house and you'd like to predict the price that it will get on the market or something like that. And this is, of course, our data set. Each one of these points is, an xi, yi pairs. And our model class or f, let's say we're going to say, is going to be y hat equals w0 plus w1 x. We have a linear model class. This is a line fit. And so for any particular xi, here is what the data set says xi, yi should be. And here is where our model predicts y hat I to be given this model. And these ideas extend trivially from linear regression. So far, this is linear regression, or the simplest line fit, to polynomial in X. And the way that's typically done is by noting a simple fact that you can write y hat equals w0 plus w1 x. So this is the intercept and the slope of that line. This would be a first order polynomial, but you can easily generalize this to higher order powers of x. So this is x squared, and I've added w2, and I can just repeat this process for any dth order power. So this is the dth polynomial, dth degree polynomial, if I just add that many powers of x, and I can still represent this as a linear function of w. It is not a linear function of x, but it is a linear function of w. I can do that by just stacking together all the w's into a feature vector and all the x's, all the powers of x into a feature vector, and this is essentially w transpose phi of x, where phi is a feature function that takes x and stacks together its powers, and it gives me a vector of that. So this is still a linear problem. So this is linear in W. It is polynomial in X, but this allows us to study all the same techniques. For example, you're ultimately going to be doing min W, the loss of W over a data set, which in this case is going to be 1 over n, summation I from 1 to n, yi minus W transpose phi of x squared, if this is a squared loss. This is where your model predicts x will lie. This is what the true training data set says, and you're just minimizing squared loss. So this is a fairly simple model. You've probably seen this in other contexts, but we are really going to use this as a test bed for explaining this notion of both nested model families and regularization. So if we go back to our figure of error decomposition in nested model families, this particular polynomial regression analysis is actually a very nice way of showing model classes. So first order polynomial is a particular kind of model class. It has two parameters, W0 and W1. And a dth order polynomial is a different kind of model class. It has d plus 1 parameters from W0 all the way till WD. The interesting thing is that these are nested model classes. So if I draw that figure, our 0th order polynomial, so 0th order polynomial is a model class that has only one parameter, which is W0. And I can draw a nested model class of first order polynomial, which has two parameters, W0 and W1. And I can similarly draw around it a nested model class of dth order polynomials, which have d plus 1 parameters, W0, W1, all the way till WD, right? Each point in these sets is a particular configurations of W's, and we notice that these sets are nested in that they contain subsequent ones as subsets, as strict subsets. Because what I can do is I can set any of the higher order parameters to 0. If I set them to 0, I shrink back to a lower order polynomial. And so search in these nested classes has this interesting phenomena that by setting or pushing some of the parameters to 0, I am preferring simpler model classes or smaller model classes. And so that's one intuition of a regularizer, that we can actually express our preference between model classes by trying to penalize the norm of W, for example, and that's what we'll get down to. Okay, let's take a particular example, and this is a example that I really like. Let me make a quick adjustment to my tablet because I'm going to need the keyboard for this. So I like this example because it is almost a practical scenario, but also close to something that I was very interested in. So for several years in the past, I was really into running, like medium distance, long distance, half marathon. I've done one marathon and trained for another one, but really half marathons were my happy place. They were the right distance. Marathons take too much of a toll on the body. And the interesting thing about tracking the speed of marathon and half marathon runners is that they exhibit a counterintuitive trend. In most other sports, people get to the pinnacle of their sport pretty early on. If you think about gymnasts, they start retiring at 20. Other sports, like, if you're in your early 20s, you track any world records, that's when those are achieved. Half marathon and marathon running is a particularly interesting phenomena where people find that if you track the age of the runner and their max speed that they might achieve in a particular competition, and by max speed I mean the speed of their fastest averaged over the time for their run, the best times that they're posting. It tends to have this fairly odd phenomena that people peak late in their careers. Turns out that a number of studies have shown that the most of the records tend to come as late as 29, 30 or so. And interestingly, people tend to hold on to competitiveness for a long time over their careers. So if you've ever been out street running or participating in any races, it is absolutely, disheartening when you're running uphill and you see someone significantly older just like running laps around you because they're significantly better trained and they've kept that fitness up over the years. And so this right here, this curve of going up and being able to hold competitiveness, this is reality. We do not know this. There have been studies suggested. So this shape is generally right. Don't take my word for the exact numbers. But let's say you are a scientist who is trying to figure out what is this physical phenomena like. Can I predict people's speeds based on how old they are? And you want to know how far people hold their competitiveness and so on. You do not know this curve. You're trying to estimate this curve. You're the first one. You bring in subjects into your lab. You put them on a treadmill. You ask them to ask them for their ages. You record their speeds and times, and maybe these are the speeds you record. That a 10-year-old is running at 6 miles per hour. 15-year-olds are running at 9. 29-year-olds are holding 13 miles per hour. By the way, 13 miles per hour is in a lot of treadmills the fastest or faster than the fastest you can go. So in a lot of treadmills won't go up to 13 miles an hour. And marathon and half marathon runners are holding that pace for the half marathon runners are holding it for an hour. The marathon runners are holding it for 2 hours. So this is an insane sport. But you conduct this study, you bring them into the lab, you have this data set, and then what you do is you would like to fit a model to this. So let me open up a particular demo where I've already done this. So I've input that data that I showed on the previous slide onto this field. So we've put in our X's and Y's, and we're going to do linear or polynomial fitting to this data. So here on the x-axis are those ages going from 10 to 60. On the y-axis are the speeds. This is a 0th order polynomial fit to that function. 0th order being that there's just one parameter. It's just W0. It does not depend on x at all. And so all you learn is a mean of this data set. And now that mean parameter here in this case is just 1. it's after scaling, so it's 10 in this case. So 10 miles per hour is what you predict what everybody's running at. And clearly it is wrong. Some people are running slower, some people are running faster than that. Let's do a first order fit. And so this is the line that we're fitting. And if this is a better fit, so if you measured the L2 losses, the L2 distances, the squared errors have gone down. But this, as if you are a scientist, if you're trying to publish this study and understand human behavior, this fit may be a better fit, but it is a bad hypothesis about what's going on with humans, because your model is now suggesting that as people get older, they get faster, and they just get linearly faster. So the older you get, the faster you become. And clearly that is incorrect. You have your intuitions telling you that just can't possibly be. And even my data, if I just squint at it, tells me that's not what's happening. And so I increase that to a second order polynomial. Now I get three numbers, W0, W1, W2. And the fit seems to have increased. I have that. I can increase that to a third order polynomial. And this starts to feel right. And I say feel right because if you are the first person trying to understand what the actual phenomena is, then you do not know what the right answer is. You just have to rely on predictions that this model makes about other data that is not yet on this chart. This is a fourth order polynomial. Not much seems to change. But we can keep going, right? We can go to a fifth order polynomial. The fit seems even better. All the points are now closer to the line. We're making better predictions. And if you've been through this rodeo before, you know where this goes. I have 8 data points, which means, at best I can fit 8 parameters, because 8 unknowns, 8 inequalities. I'm going to get perfect fit in that case. So let's just hike it up. So this is a 7th order polynomial. And this is the perfect fit. You could not do better than this. Every single point is being perfectly predicted as a function. But this function as a physical phenomena is predicting that somewhere between the age of 50 and 60, people just get insanely fast. They lose it very quickly. They gain that capability and they lose it almost immediately. But if you can catch the right 57-year-olds, man, you can break a bunch of world records. Now this curve seems ludicrous because we know something about this problem. We have intuitions. X, the variable, has a semantic understanding. Y, the variable, has a semantic understanding. These are all low-dimensional problems. We can visualize the curve. But now imagine doing this for significantly higher, for significantly higher dimensional data that you do not have physical intuitive understanding for. You make some measurements through some telescope. You're trying to predict, some physical or non-physical phenomena, and you have no physical intuitions about what the right answer should be or what poor predictions are. Your plot will tell you that this is the perfect fit. This is as good as we can do, but you should not trust that because you don't have an automated way to not trust that. And this right here is where regularizers come in. If we just scroll down and look at the W's that are being learned, we almost immediately see that some of the parameters are very high magnitude. So there's we are starting to do small magnitude all the way to the 7th order polynomials, but it has to be offset by W0 having to become of magnitude 100, right? So there's 10 to the plus 2 sitting here because all of the 8th order powers, so the 7th order powers are kicking in, and as soon as someone, X goes out to 60, it has to be counteracted. Those large numbers have to be counteracted by W0s. And so this is an intuition for expressing simplicity in these functions by writing down a penalty on the norm of W. if we leave W0 out and start penalizing the norm of W1 through WD, what we are explicitly expressing is that we prefer to be close to the mean of the data set. Because if W1 through WD was all 0, we would get back to a 0th order polynomial, which is the mean of the data set. So I will pause here and take a look at some of the questions. So hopefully this example conveys to you the need for regularization. There are various forms of regularization. It's a way of expressing penalty. The most common one is the L2 regularization, where you just take the the norm, the L2 norm of the parameters, and if it's a matrix, then it's just Frobenius norm, where you're just summing over all elements summing over the squared of all the elements of W's. There is L1 norm, which is sum of absolute values of those parameters. If you've taken a convex optimization class, you know that L1 norm is an approximation, is the closest convex approximation to an L0 norm, which is sparsity inducing. And so the behavior of an L1 norm mimics the behavior of an L0 norm, which tries to set most of the entries to 0 and keeps a sparse set of entries to be non-zero. You can often combine these things. In deep learning, you'll typically see L2 norm called weight decay, and it's because when you start taking the gradients of the L2 norm, you basically get the value, W back as the gradient, and so the larger the W, the more the gradient tends to be, and so it tends to you're encouraging decay towards 0, but it's the same concept that it's L2 regularization. Interestingly, what we are also going to start seeing in deep learning is that there are a number of other ways of expressing simplicity, of normalization, of expressing regularizing effects. This idea of dropout has become really popular over the years, and batch normalization and instance normalization is something that we will actually look at in some later lectures. And so to summarize, why regularize? It's to express preference over the weights. If you have some domain knowledge, if you know something about the model class and the data domain, then you may want to say that, I know something about these features, therefore these weights that multiply them have to live in these regimes, and so I can normalize them in some way. It is also used to make the model to express a preference towards simpler models, and in some cases, there are clear benefits to optimization. You're adding a quadratic term, and so you can end up making a non-smooth optimization problem smooth by adding curvature. That tends to typically not be the case or intuition or the primary need from a deep learning perspective, because we're doing gradient-based first-order methods. We typically will never do second-order or Hessian-based optimizations of the loss function in deep learning. We typically will live in data regimes where we do not have expert intuition, and so it tends to be this second one tends to be the primary motivation in deep learning, to express simplicity and to improve generalization. And often even the choice of regularizer ends up being treated as a hyperparameter. Whatever helps generalization to a held out set is what is usually chosen. Okay, so to recap, we now have a full objective function, and this was the term that was confusing in the last lecture. We have a full objective function which consists of a loss and a regularizer, and this is what we optimize, and we will talk about how to optimize it in future lectures. Okay, so let's move to our next topic, which is, we're heading into neural networks or multi-layer perceptrons to be precise. Before we actually tell you how to optimize these parameters, we will, for a loss function, we will actually tell you how to expand the model class. So far, we've been doing everything in the linear classifier regime for image classification. This is our input X, or what we will also say is our raw input X. And by raw, this term often is used to indicate that this is unprocessed, that we are we're not storing it in some reasonable representation space that we believe is amenable for classification. This is just as the data came in, RGB. We directly have a matrix multiplication that gives us the class scores, and we showed you what those look like. We also mentioned how linear classifiers run into problems whenever you have data that is not linearly separable. So there is no hyperplane that can be drawn either through the origin or otherwise that achieves 100% accuracy, even at training time on this data set, where you place all all positive classes on one side and all negative classes on the other side. And this is why if you take a computer vision class, large portions of that class, or even an NLP class or anything else, any data-based class where the focus is on the regime of the kinds of data that's collected, large parts of that class will be devoted to what is known as feature design or feature construction or feature representation, where expert intuition or the domain knowledge is used to construct some better representation phi of x. So if this is the raw input that we are calling x, people spend large parts of their time designing representations, hand designing representations on which you can then do machine learning. So the downstream processing of linear classifiers, nonlinear classifiers, decision trees, whatever, is typically done on some representation that is constructed by domain experts. The intuition for doing this is that some spaces can be more amenable to methods than others. Here's a simple intuition for that, that this is a one-dimensional x versus y space. Let me not call this y, let me call this x1 and x2. And this is the positive class, and let's say this is the negative class. And what you're trying to do is train a classifier to separate these two classes. A linear classifier cannot handle this. However, if you just change the representation space to r comma theta, so in this two-dimensional space, you notice that these points are roughly at a unit radius or some constant radius. You're going to get in r comma theta space, the blue points all have different theta values, but nearly identical r values. And the red points were close to the origin, so they have small r values. And in this space, it's fairly easy to draw a linear decision boundary. And we're basically just massaging in r comma theta space. A vertical line is a circle in this space, because a vertical line in r comma theta space means that you have constant r. Constant r means that you're drawing a circle in the x1, x2, or x comma y space. But this is just a simple example to illustrate that representation spaces matter. The space you're operating in changes what linearity can do. Because it's linearity in that space. And this is the same argument as we presented for polynomial regression. It's polynomial in X, but it's linear in W. And so linear in W applied to a different space can do different things. So this is just to say that this is why a lot of time and effort is spent in designing phi of X spaces, where it could be color histograms. So you divide RGB values into some bins, and you can convert images into color histograms. Or in computer vision, it was pretty common to use something called the histogram of oriented gradients, where you broke down images into these cells. Within each cells, you computed boundaries of or gradients of objects, and you computed histograms of those gradients locally within these cells. And this was used to represent shape features and shape of objects, and then the classification or detection was done on top of these features. And NLP is filled with these kinds of examples as well. The intuition being that, we're going to take a fairly different, as we mentioned in L1 in the first lecture, we're going to take a different approach to some of these problems. Instead of doing manual feature extraction, and then learning on top of that, where learning is stopping here. We're going to build models that are going to operate directly on X, and we are going to perform a sequence of operations that along the way are going to construct phi1 of X, and then phi2 of X, and then so on which we are doing classification. All of these phis for us will be learned as opposed to hand design. Okay, so that's the intuition we're working with. So far, we told you about linear classification or multi-class logistic regression, in which it was, W transpose X, and so every point here was a particular W. We will now expand this this class, and we'll try to build larger model classes. So before I get into that, let me see if there are any questions. So this is, neural networks without the brain analogies. And to be honest, there are a lot of brain analogies in neural networks, but we have to be careful. We have to present. So what I will do is I will present a mathematical formulation of how I view neural networks. We will then tell you why they're called neural in the first place, because of their historical connections to neuroscience. But those historical connections at this point are tenuous at best and can often be misleading at worst, and misrepresentative. Machine learning has over time become somewhat detached from trying to build models of the human brain. And now we no longer view neural networks in any way, shape, or form as representative models of the human brain, or as models that can be used for neuroscience. We view them just as model classes, where the goal being that we want to do function fitting, X to Y, supervised learning. The goal is not for the model class to be biologically plausible. And so it's important to keep that detachment in mind. Okay, so here's a linear classifier. We're doing WX. And I want to make this more sophisticated. By that, I mean, I want to expand the set of functions. So remember, our hypothesis set was set from X to Y, the space of all possible functions that can be represented. So I want to expand the space of functions that can be represented by a single matrix multiplication. Here is my question to you. Can I replace this by two matrices? So if I just do two matrix multiplications, it is more computation. Maybe it is even more parameters. But can W2 times W1 times X represent more functions than W transpose X? And I'll pose that as a question and pause for a second. So this seems trivial in hindsight, that obviously the product of two matrices is a matrix. Why are you wasting my time in a grad class? But this is important to realize when you get to more sophisticated functions, that is there a one-to-one mapping? And here's one way of breaking that mapping. How about if I say F is equal to W2 times max of 0, W1 of X. And notice that, this is a vector multiplied by a matrix. So this is going to give you a vector again. So really what a max of 0, a vector means is that we will proceed element wise. So what we are really saying is that this is a vector where you will do max of 0. So if this is H, then max of 0, H1, max of 0, HD, and so on. So I'm doing element-wise comparison of this matrix multiplication followed by 0. That gives me a new vector, and I'm multiplying that by W2. So quick question, is this a higher expressive model class? Can this operation be represented by a W3, X as well? This is more expressive, a model class. And it's trivial you can actually think of this very easily in a one-dimensional space. So if X is a scalar, and you write down, and so therefore W1 is also a scalar. So max of 0, W1 times X looks like a function like this. We've drawn it before. W1 is telling you the slope of of this part of the line. Anytime that becomes negative, you end up with 0. So this is what max of 0 comma w1 x looks like, and no matter how you multiply this with a w2 scalar, whether that scalar is positive or negative, you will get a piecewise linear function. You will not get a linear function. You will not be able to express that piecewise linear function by a single line. So if W2 is positive, you will get something that has the same shape as what I've drawn. If W2 is negative, then the shape will just be inverted. But either way, it's a piecewise linear function. You cannot fit that function with a single line, with a single parameter, W3. And this notion that these maxes are introducing pieces and you're forming a piecewise linear function generalizes from one dimension to higher dimensions as well. And in fact, in homework 2 or 3, we will give you a question where you're counting the pieces. How many pieces in high dimensional spaces do you end up forming by this? Okay, so this right here is our simplest 2-layer neural network with a particular choice of nonlinearity. We inserted a nonlinearity between these two matrix multiplications, and that's what made it not collapse to a matrix multiplication. And we can interpret this, we can view this visually. So our input x lived in some high dimensional space, 3072. We can now think of this matrix multiplication W1 as resulting in an intermediate variable h. Let's say the dimensions of W was 100 times 3072. We do not have to jump directly to a 10-dimensional score space. We have jumped first to a 100-dimensional space with W1, and W2 is what converts a 100-dimensional vector into a 10-dimensional vector. So the size of W2 is 10 cross 100. H is an intermediate activation vector in a neural network. This right here is a layer which corresponds to a particular setting of parameters W1. This is another layer. These are both linear layers with a non-linearity in between, which is max. And the intuition we had drawn in the linear classification lecture was that if you jump directly from X to S, the rows of W could be reshaped and visualized as templates that were multiplying X, certain elements of X. And that we could see what those templates look like. Now we are not jumping directly from X to S, we are jumping to an intermediate variable H. And so you can think of this as multiple templates in between. So remember we told you about this horse template that seemed to have blurred the right-facing horse and the left-facing horse. Now you can imagine that there is an H1 template that looks for the right-facing horse, that ignores the left-facing horse, and there is an H2 template that looks for the left-facing horse and ignores the right-facing horse. So what you can have is that this value H1 is high when right-facing horse happens, H2 is high when left-facing horse happens, and the score can basically have positive assignments to both of them, so that you're essentially representing the score for the horse class as an OR function for either facing right or left. And this is a way of saying that there are multiple templates that we are constructing in between. Those templates are all shared across different categories. So those templates could be looking at parts of objects that are common. For example, if your data set contains cars and bicycles and motorcycles, there may be a template that emerges to detect wheels. We do not know whether that will happen, but it is something that we can post hoc analyze and visualize. And this is something that we will do in later lectures. This is a simple formula. You can repeat this process. We can make this this stacking of activations and features deeper. We can make this a 3-layer neural network by doing one matrix multiplication, doing a max with respect to 0, doing another matrix multiplication, doing a max with respect to 0, and a third matrix multiplication. And this gives us our scoring function. And this is to go from X to H1 vector, to go to H2 vector, and then finally to S. And W1 is playing the role, W1 and max is playing the role in this conversion, W2 is playing the role in this conversion, and W3 is playing the role in this conversion. And I'm not explicitly writing down the maxes here, but yes, they exist. And so this is how these things are typically drawn. So typically you will find this sort of circular diagram representation of nodes in a graph representing x, entries of x, nodes in a graph representing entries of h. So this is h1, this is some hj, and so on. And finally the s1 and s2. So there's an input layer, a hidden layer. These things are called hidden layers because we do not actually have, we do not observe what their values should be. They are essentially things that are in between. We know what S should be, we observe X, but we do not observe what any of these layers in between should be. So this is a 2-layer neural network or a 1 hidden layer neural network. This is a 3-layer neural network with 2 hidden layers and so on. These circles or nodes in this graph are often called neurons or artificial neurons as an analogy to the neural networks or brain models for which these things were initially built. But at this point, they have no connection to neuroscience at all. So it is just a legacy name that we end up using. There's no biological plausibility in these things over time. The output from one layer is the input to the next layer, and each layer has its own set of weight. And that's why these are called multi-layer networks or multi-layer perceptrons, because these neurons are often sometimes called perceptrons. Okay, quick note on notation. We often use both these notations, that this is a 2-layer neural network or this is a 1 hidden layer neural network, where we're not counting the input layer in the total number of layers. You know, by 2010 standards, anything greater than 2 layers or anything greater than 1 layer is a deep neural network. By 2020 standards, ResNets, for example, the standard ResNet in computer vision is either 18-layer ResNet or 50-layer ResNet, and there are significantly deeper architectures that have been explored. By 2019, 2020 research standards, there are architectures that have also considered infinite depth neural networks, where you express neural networks as where you express the model as the convergence point of some, as a fixed point of some recurrence relations. If you're interested in those things, reach out to your TAs. They can send you pointers to those papers. But for our perspective, we're going to be dealing with depth in some reasonable computationally bound regimes. So that is a neural network, and out of obligation, because it feels that I must cover this, I will make a connection to actual biological neurons, but I have to admit, I feel very bad every year doing this because I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm not a neuroscientist. This would be like someone trying to explain to me how neural networks work without having any idea of what they are. So you should take this at a very high level of abstraction. You should know that please do not play around with biological similarities. You do not get to throw these things around as just intuitions. There is an actual field that studies this. They are experts, and our understanding of their field is stuck in somewhere in the 1960s. So that's the level of understanding I'm presenting to you. And let's be careful about this understanding. I'm presenting this to you only for the sake of completeness. And the sake of completeness comes is that our understanding of neurons is that they consist of dendrites that serve as essentially inputs to these neurons, and they consist of axons that play the role of outputs of these neurons. And it was to mathematically build a model for a neuron. It was found that one way of modeling the synaptic communication behavior and the activation behavior was to say that neurons are essentially this mathematical abstraction where they have the strength of the connection between neurons can be indicated by these scalars connecting these two neurons. Those are the weights. X's represent the incoming strength of the signal from adjacent neurons. We are going to accumulate these incoming activations by the strength of proportional to the strength of the connection, so linear combinations. And we're going to have an output which they found that a sigmoid function seemed to capture the behavior of the firing of these neurons. So a sigmoid function is essentially 1 over 1 plus e to the negative x, whose shape is shown here. And this was the level of mathematical modeling of a single neuron, which could then be stacked up together to form a neural network. But as I said, please be careful. There are many different kinds of neurons. We have colleagues who study these sort of things. Machine learning people already get a bad rap. Do not start making biological analogies. The bigger problem is that machine learning, the field, has drifted from building accurate models of the human brain as its primary focus. Neural networks, the goal is to do better in terms of generalization. And there's a lot more interesting and sophisticated phenomena going on here. If you're interested in this, search start with this paper and go from there and learn more about this field. And for us, activation functions are going to come in a lot of different varieties. There's going to be a sigmoid activation function, which used to be common pretty early on in neural network literature, but these days is typically not used. And the sigmoid, as I said, is 1 over 1 plus e to the negative x. You've kind of met this type of function in the log sum x sort of problems. Tan h is another function which is 2 times sigmoid of 2x minus 1. It is also sometimes represented as e to the x minus e to the minus x divided by e to the x plus e to the minus x. So it's functionally, the shape-wise, quite similar to tan h. You've met ReLU already, where it's max of 0, x. And these, remember that x in these cases are often hidden hidden features coming from the previous layer. So this shape you've already met. There are versions of ReLU that do not give you 0 gradient on the left side, because if you notice, one of the problems with ReLU is that the left side has slope 0, which means the gradients will be 0. So there were attempts at fixing that by providing it a small constant linear slope. There are generalizations of ReLU that use something called, there are generalizations of ReLU that use something called max out, where instead of having a single W transpose X and 0, you have a W1 transpose X and a W2 transpose X. And then there are generalizations that smooth this nonlinearity out and have some other interesting phenomena. This is an active area of development. New nonlinearities get proposed all the time to solve certain kinds of problems. In a lot of the sort of workhorse of machine learning tends to be ReLU, but this is something that continues to be in development. One thing that I want to quickly mention is this comparison between sigmoid and tan h. They look quite similar, and they are in fact related. So tan h, as I said, is 2 sigmoid of 2x or 2a minus 1. But in practice, sigmoid is almost never used. And one of the things to notice is that sigmoid is always positive, and tan h has both a positive output component and a negative output component. So let me pause here and quickly ask people why they think this might be a problem, that sigmoid is all positive and tan h has both a positive and a negative component. I'll wait for you folks to type your answers in the chat, but in the meantime, I will tell you that think about what a neural network does. If you start with an X and there's sigmoid sitting here after each H computation, so this is H1, this is H2, and so on, what is happening is that every time as you go along the layers, there is a summation of some input values, some HI type values that can pass through a sigmoid, which are then summed up again in the next layer, which get passed through a sigmoid, and so on. So why might this sort of cascade of sigmoid summation, as opposed to tan h summation, why might that be a problem, or what might be the concerns with trying to sum up all positive values versus a mix of positive and negative values? Okay. Just a quick note. So we're a minute over. I'll stop in a second after this slide. Just a quick note that in practice, even tan H is not used. There is a specific form of tan H, which is this multiplicative factor times 2 over 3, 1.7159 tan H of 2 over 3 of 2x. And the reason why these magic parameters show up is that in the +1 to -1 regime, this tan H function is far more linear because the scaling is appropriate. That it in that regime it behaves linear in that scaling, and so this is an interesting phenomena where we are trying to push non-linearity into our neural networks, but because we're going to do gradient-based optimizations in the regime that we are operating, we try to make them behave linearly because we're trying to avoid the saturating regime of the gradients. This is a problem that ReLU functions don't suffer from because they don't have saturated regions where you get zero gradients. But this is just something to keep in mind. Okay, we'll stop here with new content so people can step out if they have other meetings and other classes and so on. I'm happy to still stick around for a few more minutes and take more questions.